ChatGPT and other similar pieces of software have recently taken the world by storm, and I, like I'm sure many of you, have spent some time playing around with them to get an idea of what they can do. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in the future, with my prompts getting great answers that give me insights that I may never have come across myself just by Googling. Other times, not so much. But when a product this popular and potentially this useful comes out, it's important to know how to use it well. Because if you're using ChatGPT to generate a choose-your-own-adventure style game for you to play through, then it's no big deal if it makes a few silly mistakes once in a while. You just keep playing. But if you use it to help you make decisions that are considerably more impactful and important, such as planning your financial future, and it makes some silly mistakes then, that could potentially end up being a bit more damaging. So today I'm going to be walking through a conversation that I had with ChatGPT for this video about how to achieve financial independence to show you how you can use this incredibly useful tool to continue to deepen your financial knowledge base, hopefully without any major nasty surprises down the line. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a 30-day free trial of Audible and 2 free audiobooks of your choice, as well as a list of some books on money I'd recommend checking out with your free trial. So before we get into the fun part of writing prompts and getting answers, I do feel obligated to briefly touch on a few things that we should all be keeping in mind when using tools like ChatGPT, or just researching new things in general, really. The first is that no tool or source of information is perfect. Not Google, not ChatGPT, not this channel, nothing. Even the most useful and insightful resources sometimes make mistakes, or have biases that color their judgment. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't take advantage of the tools that are available to us, it just means that we should be thinking critically about the information that we're consuming. Basically, especially when it comes to those high leverage decisions, take things with a grain of salt until you can verify their accuracy for yourself. Ideally through a combination of seeking out disconfirming information and testing the hypothesis on your own. Another thing to keep in mind with ChatGPT in particular is that its information may be out of date for more recent events. At this point in time, it'll still give you an answer to the question you ask, even if the question requires information outside of its training period, which ended in 2021. It's just that that answer has a good chance to be incomplete or outright incorrect. For instance, I asked what the price return of the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, ticker symbol VOO, was for January 2022, and ChatGPT claimed that it had gained 5.48% during that month, which was outright wrong. It lost value during that month. So being aware of what time frame your question requires the model to be aware of to answer accurately is important. With that being said, let's see what ChatGPT's guide to achieving financial independence looks like and how we can use it as a jumping off point to broaden our financial knowledge base. So the original prompt I started out with was, can you give me a step-by-step guide on how to achieve financial independence with the option to retire early? The response contained 9 steps. Let's go over each of these steps individually. Step 1 was to set financial goals. How much income do you want to have coming in once you're financially independent? And how much will you need to save in order to generate that income? This is a very solid starting point. It's difficult to reach any goal, let alone a long-term one like financial independence, without at least having a general idea of where you're headed. However, there are some things that were not explicitly mentioned in this step, or any of the others for that matter. For instance, how do you know how much money you're going to need to save in order to generate the income you desire in financial independence? And what about the time frame? The path is going to look a lot different if you're willing to achieve financial independence 40 years from now versus if you want to achieve it in the next 10 years or less. When I asked follow-up questions about these points, it did give me solid responses, such as being able to determine the amount of savings you need to generate a certain level of income by calculating the difference between what your retirement income, including Social Security, pensions, and part-time work, and expenses will be, after adjusting for inflation of course, and then using a retirement calculator or financial planner to determine a savings goal. But it would have been nice if that detail had been pointed out initially. One thing that I would add is that most financial calculators that are publicly available online will use some variant of the inflation-adjusted withdrawal approach, with the most frequently used implementation being the 4% rule popularized by retired financial advisor William Bengen. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with that approach. It's also worth noting that there are other approaches that may serve certain people better depending on their financial situation and goals. And the results that come from these calculators are sensitive to the quality of the data it's fed, whether that data comes from your own inputs, historical investment return data, or even the asset allocation that's being used, which you may or may not be able to explicitly set yourself depending on the calculator you're working with. It also didn't explicitly point out the importance of making goals reasonable. Psychology is potentially one of the biggest challenges that we face on our road to financial independence. If we're setting unreasonable goals, such as achieving FI in 2 or 3 years with a maximum potential savings rate of like 5% of our income, we could easily be setting ourselves up for future disappointment. That being said, goals and the approaches that we take to reach them can and do change over time. There's nothing wrong with starting small, such as by saving 1% of our income and then gradually raising that amount over time, say by 1% a month until we've reached a level that is both substantial relative to the goals that we're chasing in the timeline we're trying to achieve them on, and sustainable. Step 2 was to assess our current financial situation. What does our income and budget look like? What's our current net worth? Pretty simple and straightforward. I don't really have anything else to add here. Anytime you're chasing a goal, you need to know where you are and where you want to be. That's essentially what these first 2 steps help you figure out. Step 3 was to create a budget and try to find areas to reduce spending so that you can maintain a high savings rate. When asked how to create a budget, the response was pretty standard. Calculate your income, identify and categorize your expenses based on whether they are fixed or variable, set goals for things like emergency and retirement savings, and, if desired, a down payment on a home, allocate your income toward your expenses, covering the fixed expenses first, then the variable expenses and financial goals based on how you're prioritizing them with any of the funds that are left over after covering those fixed expenses. And finally, regularly review your budget to determine if it's still working well for you, as well as to find areas where you can cut expenses more effectively. All fine and good. It doesn't really go into the different possible budgeting styles that some people may find easier to stick with over the long term, or even hint that other approaches may be out there. But as the comprehensive style of budget's greatest strength is the financial awareness that it brings you, it makes sense that it's the one that the AI went with when it's explicitly stating that you should be reviewing your budget regularly to check for areas where you can cut back on expenses. When asked what are the best ways to save a substantial amount of your income, ChatGPT responded with the following list of ideas, which you can see on your screen now. Obviously, this list is not comprehensive, and some of the items are more relevant to the question asked than others. For instance, investing for the long term, while incredibly important, doesn't really directly increase your savings rate. Though if all goes well, it does increase your net worth over time. And while it doesn't explicitly say it, this response does subtly reference one of the major debates in budgeting. That debate being, which is better? Focusing on optimizing the big savings opportunities, such as through house or transportation hacking, or focusing on the smaller but more frequent savings opportunities that, when put together, can lead to a large overall savings. In other words, focusing on the latte factor. Both approaches are fully capable of leading to higher savings rates, but for some, one will be easier to sustain over the long term than the other. For me personally, I found it easier to sustain a high savings rate by focusing on the big ticket savings opportunities, rather than cutting out a large swath of my smaller expenses like entertainment. If I did both, and at some points in life I have, my savings rate would be higher, but eventually I feel I would burn out and relapse with a bit of a spending spree that I likely wouldn't even enjoy as much as I would have if I were just spending reasonable amounts of money on my wants on a more consistent basis. Unfortunately, even with a bit of prodding, there are a couple of things that were not explicitly covered in this step. For instance, it did mention that it was important for budgets to contain sections for emergency savings, long-term investments, and retirement, but did not specifically specify how much one should be saving for emergencies. The common rule of thumb is roughly 3 to 6 months worth of expenses for most people, though some with irregular or uncertain income streams like the self-employed may opt for more. It also didn't mention the need to put aside money for irregular but potentially large expenses, such as buying or repairing a car. Now, for some people, these expenses could fall under the long-term investment umbrella, or just be obvious enough that the response omitting them wouldn't have mattered. And for those people, this response would have been perfectly fine. But for others who wouldn't have thought of these line items, it would have been nice to see them mentioned somewhere in the response. Step 4 was to reduce your debts. It recommended paying off the highest interest debts first using the debt avalanche approach, which is a perfectly valid approach, and if you can stick with it, Mathematically, it's arguably as effective, if not even more so, than any other. However, it's not necessarily going to be the best option for every person. Other strategies like the debt snowball, which has you paying off your debts in order from smallest to largest balance to give you those quick psychological wins, or the debt tsunami, which has you paying off your debts in the order from most to least stressful, or, as many of you have mentioned in the past, paying off debts in descending order of the minimum payment required, or even some hybridized approach, could be more sustainable depending on the person. Ultimately, the best approach is probably to just go with whatever strategy gives you the highest likelihood of finishing the job and getting the debts paid off, because eliminating your debts will help you to achieve financial independence by lowering your burn rate and ongoing expenses in general, which will lower the amount you need to save in order to reach financial independence and simultaneously increase your savings rate in the present. It also lowers your financial risk should an undesirable, unexpected event occur, such as a medical emergency. Step 5 was to start investing. It specifically recommended stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. Obviously, this is a crucial step to achieving financial independence, because at the end of the day, by definition, you'll eventually need to have the ability to sustain yourself financially without actively earning an income if you want to be considered financially independent. Which means you need to have some sort of passive income stream. The most common forms that passive income streams take are investments. Whether they're in stocks, bonds, real estate, or some other alternative asset, they all serve the purpose of generating some sort of income or wealth appreciation that can be transformed into income without the need for your active labor. Unfortunately, there was no mention of where to invest, such as in a 401k, IRA, HSA, or regular brokerage account, or the order to invest your money in. Because most of us who have access to a 401k with an employer match would probably want to take advantage of that match, since it's literally free money, before putting funds into a regular taxable brokerage account. But it does at least give you the idea to learn more about investing, since it is a crucial part in achieving financial independence. Step 6 was to focus on increasing your income through working extra hours, selling things you don't need, or starting a side hustle. Again, I don't have much to add here because if you're trying to achieve financial independence, increasing your income is a solid plan given how important your savings rate is in that process. I'll just point out that some of these steps in the real world can, and probably should, be accomplished simultaneously. For instance, trying to increase your income by selling things or working a side job could go a long way to helping you finish out the 4th step of paying down your debts. Steps 7, 8, and 9 were less steps and more just things you do periodically throughout your whole journey. They were to stay disciplined and avoid impulse purchases, regularly monitor your progress and adjust your strategies as needed, and continue learning more about finance as time goes by. While I would argue that staying disciplined is important, especially at the beginning, it's also important to make an effort to incorporate financially beneficial behaviors into your day-to-day lifestyle. In other words, focus on building habits instead of just resisting temptations. One habit that I found particularly helpful in avoiding making impulse purchases is to wait a week whenever you come across something that you want to buy that's not an urgent need. If, after a week of waiting, you still want to buy the thing as much as you did when you first stumbled across it, then by all means buy it. But if you don't, then great. You just saved yourself from experiencing buyer's remorse. But that's just one technique that I've found helpful. There are countless others that people have used in order to avoid making impulse purchases that they later regret. In terms of adjusting your strategies as needed, it's good advice, so long as you're not overdoing it. If you make some mistakes in your first few budgets, it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. At most, it takes you a month or two to get it corrected. But that's not the case in every domain of personal finance. Many traders have found themselves in tough spots by trading or changing their strategies too frequently. And many more investors have lost tons of money buying or selling at the wrong time out of greed or panic. So basically, make sure that if you're going to adjust your strategy, it's because it no longer fits your goals and situation, or because you've uncovered a fundamental flaw in the plan, and not just because it's working less optimally than you had hoped in recent times. In other words, patience is a virtue. So that is ChatGPT's guide to financial independence. It's certainly not comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination, but given that we only asked a few questions, we can't really expect it to be truly comprehensive. That being said, on the whole, it's a solid start. I like that it gives you a lot of concepts to research more in depth on your own, such as the different styles of budgeting, investing, and debt payoff strategies. And I think that for a lot of people who are new to finance, it could be a solid place to start building your financial knowledge base. Asking questions that are more broad-based, like what are some different types of budgets that people use, may be more helpful in generating those jumping off points than something more specific like our initial prompt. But as we saw, even our more narrow question led to some interesting interesting insights. Just don't let it be your only source of information, as it has limitations, just like any other source. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. If you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.